Great. So good evening, everyone. Welcome to this talk on community wealth building hosted by Stratford Climate Action and Warwickshire Climate Alliance. My name is Stephen Norrie. I'm heavily involved with both organisations. Stratford Climate Action is a Stratford-based group focused on local responses to the climate emergency. You can find out a bit more about what we do by visiting our website, www.stratfordclimate.org. Amongst other things, we're currently working on a citizen science project on river pollution in the Avon. Warwickshire Climate Alliance is an umbrella organisation of climate action groups across the county. It works to, amongst other things, lobby the county council and is currently working on a climate roadshow for the north of the county. You can visit their website at warwickshireclimatealliance.org. Already said that. On to our guest. Lauren Bond is a senior researcher with the Centre for Local Economic Strategies and their lead for the West Midlands. Originally based in Manchester, she has also worked for Sandwell Council, so knows the council system from the inside, as well as from her work with the CELES. The Centre for Local Economic Strategies is the leading organisation working on community wealth building in the UK. They're a think and do tank, meaning that not only do they produce really interesting reports about all the things that can be done as part of a community wealth building strategy, and I'll provide some links in the chat, but they actually get involved with projects, provide analytics, and help set up community wealth building anchor networks, and have done so across the UK. But Lauren will tell us more about this, and then there'll be a question and answer session afterwards. So over to you, Lauren.
Great, thanks, Stephen, and lovely to be here today. Thanks for inviting me, Stephen. I really look forward to getting to speak to you all and hear any kind of questions and thoughts that you have. So I've got some slides that I'm just going to share now. Please let me know, everyone, if you can see them. Okay, can someone just give me a thumbs up or verbal? Yep, brilliant. Great, as I said, yeah, thanks for being here today. So I'm Lauren Bond, as Stephen said. I'm a senior researcher at CLERS, which is the Centre for Local Economic Strategies. I'm actually based in the West Midlands, in fact Stratford itself, so I live a few minutes walk from the town centre, so an extra nice reason to be here with you all today. So when I saw the email pop through from Stephen for a speaker at CLERS, I think there was no better person than myself to deliver the presentation. And I also work pretty much specifically in the West Midlands as well. So as you'll see through the presentation, we do work all across the UK and Ireland, but we do have quite a strong focus of the West Midlands, and that's where I do a lot of my work. So just a brief bit of background on CLERS. I know Stephen set a little bit out, but we kind of see ourselves as the national organisation for local economies. So we've actually been going since 1986. It's quite a long time now. And since then, our mission has always been about the development of local economies, but particularly those that work for people, planet and place. So as Stephen said, we're a think and do tank. So we do research, we publish reports, but we also do a lot of work on the ground in local areas with councils, devolved governments, combined authorities, NHS trusts and so on. And you'll see a bit of that throughout the presentation, but we're very much the kind of lead organisation for community wealth building in the UK. So what actually is community wealth building, obviously, is what we're here to talk about today. So I want to break that down a little bit and explain what problems it's seeking to tackle and where it sort of came from. So a lot of this stuff might not be new to you here, and this is the kind of the dark side of the presentation. This is the sort of depressing stuff, really, but hopefully we'll offer you the kind of optimistic side and look a little bit to the future of what can be done about it. But obviously, as a lot of us know, the economy in the UK isn't really working, especially at the moment. So on paper, the UK is the 6th largest national economy in the world. Really, it should be the barometer from which other countries look to. The stark reality is that the UK is the only developed economy in the world in which wages fell over the past few years whilst the economy was growing. So a couple of years ago in 2020 to 2021, around 1 in 5 people in the UK were in poverty. That's 20%. The wealthiest 10% of households in Great Britain hold 43% of all wealth in the country. And these kind of issues have become none more stark than obviously over the past few years with the pandemic, with the cost of living crisis, with the energy crisis and so on. But it's not necessarily unique to the past few years, because broadly, since the early 1900s, the total share of wealth that has gone into the pockets of the workers has been falling. But obviously things have become a little bit more to a head, so to speak, over the past few years, and now more worse than ever when it comes to the economy, and of course when it comes to climate change, which I know particularly here in the room a lot of you will be really passionate about. So the general message is that wealth is not benefiting the communities that create it, and growth is not necessarily the be all and end all. So as you can see from this graph, the pink line is GDP. So GDP since, you know, the mid-80s has been steadily rising. And generally the rhetoric would be, if you want to find out the health of an economy, you'll look to GDP. And that's sort of it. That was enough. What actually has become a lot more apparent over the past few years is that GDP and growth for growth's sake doesn't benefit people or the planet either. So if we look at the other two lines, the yellow line is the poverty rate, which has been increasing, and the blue line is average incomes as a percentage of GDP, and that has been decreasing. So it's not necessarily just about creating growth, although of course there are things we can do around regenerating town centres and all sorts of things in terms of climate change and green growth, but it's not always the be all and end all, and that's kind of where community wealth building comes in. So community wealth building really is a new approach to economics and economic development. So it really seeks to change the way that our economies have come to function by aiming to retain more of that wealth that is created and more of those opportunities for the benefit of local people. So it's not necessarily a degrowth agenda. It's not saying stop growth, but it's about ensuring that that growth actually benefits local people. So when that pink GDP line goes up, so do wages, and poverty decreases, because that wealth, that money that's being created actually benefits those local areas. So this quote kind of nicely sums it up, really, if you want a sort of nice snappy quote as to what it is. So community wealth building is a people-centered approach to local economic development, which redirects wealth back into the local economy and places control and benefits into the hands of local people. So those are the challenges it's kind of seeking to tackle, and that is ultimately what the theory of community wealth building is. So now I'll get a little bit more into how you actually do that. So one of the starting points that we have really when it comes to community wealth building is the power of anchor institutions. So traditionally, when we've spoken about economic development, we've spoken about growth, and we've spoken about the role of the private sector, and certainly there is a role for the private sector, but often public sector organisations haven't necessarily been seen as having a role as an economic actor to play in their local area. Obviously, they have social responsibilities. If you're the NHS, you have a responsibility for the health of your local people. If you're a university or a college, obviously you have responsibility for education. But you might not necessarily see yourself as an organisation that can impact the local economy, and particularly through what might seem like quite boring ways, so things like procurement and your power over land and assets. So the theory really behind anchor institutions came out when we first started the community wealth building work. And if you've heard of Clare's and community wealth building, you've probably heard of the Preston model. So Preston was the first area really where we started doing this work, although the principles really originate from America. So it started in Cleveland about 10, 15 years ago, and then came over to the UK where Clare started working with Preston. But the idea in Preston was that they were waiting for some kind of foreign inward investment to come into the city. There was a company that were due to build a shopping centre for them, and they were really, you know, revolving their whole economic strategy around the building of the shopping centre and how that would improve the local economy. The deal fell through, and they really weren't sure what to do. So the idea behind looking at their anchor institutions is, well, if you have a council and an NHS trust, a university or colleges, housing associations and so on, those organisations spend millions of pounds a year collectively, potentially upwards of billions of pounds a year. They also employ thousands of people in an area. They will often, although perhaps not as much in recent years due to, you know, having to sell a lot of it off, but they will probably still own a fair amount of land and assets in that place. So they have a lot of influence that can be used to support the local economy. So the list here is the types of organisations we look to. Businesses, we have a bit of a question mark. I think it's something that we're still trying to answer at Clare's. Originally, the theory behind anchor institutions was they were public sector, because the private sector organisations do already see themselves as having that economic role. So it was more about trying to encourage the public sector to see themselves a little bit differently. But what we do with anchor institutions is we bring them together as anchor networks, because collectively they have a lot more power than individually. And you'll see some of that through the case studies that we explore in these slides. But essentially, you know, working together, they can share opportunities, they can share challenges, they can work out, you know, different areas that they might want to target actions towards. And what we'll find is that anchor networks might be different for each different kind of place. So not every area will have the same types of anchor institutions. So for example, as Stephen said, I did a lot of work in Sandwell, just to the north of Birmingham. Birmingham has quite a few universities. I think it has about 5 universities. It has 4 or 5 large hospitals. Sandwell has no universities, it has 1 hospital. So it's a much different kind of scale. So in some circumstances like that, in a smaller area, there's not necessarily quite as many of those sort of public sector anchors. So, you know, in Sandwell particularly, we did sort of bring in private sector businesses, but also because Sandwell had a very strong connection the private sector due to being in the Black Country and its kind of industrial heritage. So sometimes it's about finding out what the local need and the local opportunity is. So in Sandwell, as we'll sort of talk about later, but they were really interested in procurement and supporting local business. So it made sense, for example, to include organisations like the Chamber of Commerce who could kind of connect us to local businesses. So there definitely is still a role for the private sector in the sort of anchor institution, anchor network approach, but generally the starting point is to look at those public sector organisations that perhaps haven't in the past seen themselves as having that strong economic role in an area. And then the other main aspect of community wealth building is the 5 pillars. So generally when you bring the anchor institutions together as an anchor network, they'll generally be looking at these different types of areas. So the first one is around socially productive use of land and property. So again, I mean, each of these we'll go into in a little bit more depth in terms of different case studies that have come out of those. But essentially, this is about supporting equitable land development. So it might be through establishing community land trusts, for example, and also allowing underutilized assets to go towards community use. Procurement is one of the most infamous aspects of community wealth building, I suppose. It's the most commonly well-known one. So if you've heard of the Preston model, you probably will have heard of their kind of progressive approach to procurement. So ultimately, as I kind of touched on with the anchor institutions point, it is about utilising those large budgets to support local businesses in a way that hasn't necessarily been done before. So really trying to keep wealth locally. So often areas will refer to it. So for example, in Wolverhampton, they refer to it as the Wolverhampton pound. So it's money that's created in Wolverhampton stays in Wolverhampton and supports local businesses, but particularly it might also be smaller businesses, cooperatively owned businesses, socially generative businesses, social enterprises, and so on. So really kind of using those powers to support different types of businesses. Then we have the finance pillar, and this is around ensuring that financial investments and pension funds are directed towards local investment priorities. So really trying to bring transformative capital to locally rooted enterprises as well. Then we have employment. I think alongside procurement, this is the other more common pillar of community wealth building. It's also generally one of the easier ones to focus on. So often anchor institutions will be one of the largest employers in their place. So the approach that they can take to employment can really have a defining effect on the employment prospects of local people and the incomes of local people as well. So it is about creating job opportunities for local residents, but particularly those who might be the furthest removed from the job market, and doing things like paying the real living wage, for example. And then they all kind of come together into the final pillar around inclusive ownership of the economy. And essentially at the heart of community wealth building is the principle that wealth is broadly held. So we mentioned earlier things like cooperatives, SMEs, mutually owned businesses, and so on, trying to support those different types of organisations that really ensure that wealth is generated stays within that locality. So anchors therefore have quite a key role to play in encouraging a diverse range of ownership models in their supply chain. So those are the 5 pillars. So most community wealth building work does centre around those kind of thematic areas, and often anchor institutions, when coming together as an anchor network, will look at those pillars, although I think it's fair to say that they don't necessarily start off with the pillar. Often they'll start off with a local challenge or a local opportunity, and they'll work to solve that. And often then they'll use one of those pillars to help them solve it. So, you know, the challenge, might be that the businesses in their local area are really struggling. So they can kind of use the procurement pillar to support them, and so on. So this is the good bit, really. I think that hopefully offers the most optimism, which is actually showing how this sort of stuff has worked in practice. So I have a few national examples. In particular, I've picked out a few that relate to climate change and net zero. And then going on, I'd like to talk a little bit more about community wealth building in the West Midlands as well, just to make it a bit more local. The West Midlands over the past 5 years has become a bit of a hotbed for this type of work, so it's great to be able to speak to different parts of the West Midlands that you know aren't doing community wealth building, or at least aren't doing it, you know, intentionally with that name at the moment, and really try and create that sort of movement. But starting off just with some national examples. So as I mentioned earlier, Preston is the most famous one. As I said, it came about really following the failure of an economic development plan based on attracted inward investment. So they really saw the need for a new approach. And through that, they set up Preston Anchor Network, so bringing in the local authority, NHS Trust, universities, colleges, and so on. And one of the big things they focused on was procurement. So you can see from this graphic here, this is from a few years ago, but over a 5-year period, they started off with about 5% spend in Preston, and they increased that to 18.2%. So that is over £74 million. And then in terms of the wider Lancashire geography as well, they went from 39% to 79.2%. So really quite large amounts. And as well, I think each area will have a different definition of what local is. So in Preston, they wanted to look at Preston, the city, and then Lancashire as the county. When I've done this work in Sandwell, it's been kind of similar. They like to look at Sandwell. And then they decided that the kind of next tier was the Black Country plus Birmingham. So different areas will have a kind of different definition of to them what is local. But essentially, you can see here what is possible in terms of trying to keep more of that wealth local. And what they found in Preston when they did this sort of work is that, you know, obviously the spend was quite low, particularly in Preston, but they were, you know, spending money on kind of offshore tax companies and all these different types of things. And one of the big things that they focused on was the procurement of food. So they weren't really spending much on food in the local area. And a reason sort of for this challenge is that the contracts were so large that a lot of local businesses didn't have the kind of capacity or ability to bid for one large contract. So what they did in Preston was actually break the contract down into smaller lots. So the primary schools in Preston will now get their eggs from one farmer, and then they get their dairy from another farmer, and then a bread from another business, and so on. So really making sure that it's as accessible to local businesses as possible, and working quite closely with them as well to kind of alert them when opportunities arise. So that's sort of one of the ways that they managed to get the spend a lot higher. And obviously these stats, you know, from a good 6 years ago now, they've very much kept on with this sort of work. I think most recently they were looking into a sort of community cooperative owned cinema and all sorts of things. So yeah, if you have heard of community wealth building before, I'm sure you'll have heard of the Preston model. But if not, if you Google it, it'll probably be one of the first things that comes up. So they've really made community wealth building a core fundamental part of the way that they do their kind of economic strategy in the city. And what they have actually found most recently, they started to evaluate a little bit more the success of Preston. I mean, a few years ago, I think it was named the most improved city to live in the Northwest, so over places like Manchester and Liverpool. But then really recently, one of my colleagues did a bit of an evaluation piece, which has been published in the HSJ, and they kind of compared Preston to some similar sized cities in England, so with similar kind of populations and similar geographies. And they found that not only were wages higher in Preston, but that mental health was kind of significantly less of an issue in Preston as well. So it's having that impact on well-being as well. And you can sort of look that piece of research up, or I can send it to Stephen to circulate it. It kind of breaks it all down in terms of how they evaluated and kind of come to those conclusions. But yeah, it really kind of does prove that although it's been over a long period of time, over sort of 10 years ago they started this work, that it very much does have an impact. Another example of something that they've done in Preston as well, and this is an example of a kind of finance pillar, which I could hear a couple of people talking at the beginning about the pension funds. I know that's been a bit of an issue in Warwickshire in terms of investing it with fossil fuel companies and things like that. So community wealth building very much does offer kind of tools for how councils in particular can better invest their pension funds in the local area. So in Preston City Council, they partnered with the County Council of Lancashire to try and maximise the social return of their pensions. So since 2013, they've allocated £100 million of investment in Preston and South Ribble, and a further 100 million in the wider Lancashire area. So it's a really good example of how you can utilise quite large amounts of money to obviously reinvest it back into the local area. Another area where we've done a lot of work is Manchester as well. So kind of similar to the Preston stats, you can see over a period, in this case of about 7 years, how they increased their spending in the city. So going from 51.5% to 73.6%, and did it in kind of very similar ways to Preston. And I've got a West Midlands example later on in the slide, which sort of really breaks down how a local authority or any other kind of anchor institution can work to try and keep more of their procurement spend locally. The next example is more of a kind of climate change net zero one, which hopefully you'll find quite interesting. So this is something that's happened in a few different parts of the country, particularly that we've worked in. So in Lewis, the south of Scotland, and in the Black Country as well. So really this one essentially is about retrofit. And I think this is a good example of how community wealth building can play a part in the sort of reduction of carbon to net zero, because in and of itself, retrofit is obviously a really positive thing in terms of, kind of leading to sort of better energy efficiency, obviously reducing fuel poverty and people's energy bills, but a way that you can have a sort of community wealth building angle to it, and the way you can bring even more benefits with these kind of particular projects is actually by trying to ensure that the businesses that do the retrofit are local, and that it's also creating local jobs as well, so those kind of green jobs for the future. So in Lewis, for example, there are 7 local authorities across the East Sussex and Greater Brighton area who partnered together. They realised that they owned a sort of combined 3,500 council houses, and realised that if they were to retrofit all of their homes, obviously not only does it have that kind of immense benefits in terms of the climate, but if they could get local businesses to create a bit of a retrofit supply chain to win that work, again, that's keeping potentially sort of millions of pounds into the local economy and creating those really good quality jobs and careers for the future. So this is something that's now starting to happen in different parts of the country. And then the next case study is a bit of an employment one. So this was in the north of Tyne, but quite a unique one, like something that's quite different. So it focuses specifically on supply teachers, which often is perhaps a profession that people don't often think about or really give much respect to. And what they sort of found, particularly in north of Tyne, is that 88% of supply teachers reported that private supply agencies were the only way that they could obtain work. Which really reflects the fact that over the past decade, agencies have replaced publicly run supplies pools. And the issues they were having is that commercial supply agencies retain up to 38% of the fees that are charged to schools. So while the teachers themselves have faced fall in pay, erosion of job security and pension rights, they're kind of having those issues around the pay, and the schools are missing out too. So fees and charges are rising significantly. So this sort of double-tapped extraction of wealth from the purses of both the public sector and workers is kind of endemic across the country. So motivated by their own experiences, a group of supply teachers in the northeast have been working really closely with the National Education Union, the National Association of Schoolmasters, the Union of Women Teachers, the North of Tyne Mayor as well, to try and create an alternative in terms of a supply teacher cooperative. So it's owned and controlled by the teachers themselves. The cooperative replaces the prioritisation of profit with an imperative to fairly pay teachers, and also to provide good terms and conditions for them as well, and also ensures that schools are receiving a high quality of service and represents the interests of the children, most importantly. So that's a really good example of ensuring fair employment, but also in terms of that kind of plural ownership of the economy as well. The next example is another one that relates very much to the kind of climate change agenda. So this one began a couple of years ago in Oldham. So the Oldham Energy Futures team essentially have worked with communities in a participative process, which has enabled residents to not only have their say in how they want the energy transition to happen in their place, but also to gain the skills and knowledge needed to take advantage of new opportunities in the low carbon sector. So this work was really enabled by the fact that Oldham Council had a pre-existing commitment to community wealth building, and they also had a local Green New Deal. And this included a focus on community-led and community-owned solutions to the energy transition. So they decided to focus on two low-income neighbourhoods in Oldham called Westwood and Shulver, and they were selected for pilots on the basis that they would perhaps benefit the most from improved local provision, that the residents there were often marginalised in decision-making, and they also had an existing strong community organising base. And as well as local residents, the project engaged with a number of key local stakeholders, such as local housing associations, to boost the project's impact. So ultimately what the project did is produce a community-owned action plan and led to the development of a toolkit, which is available on the CLES website. So again, I'm sure I can get Stephen to circulate that, which allows other places to replicate the approach. But what they decided on in those areas is three pilot projects. So one, to upgrade local buildings and create low carbon homes, to develop an EV and e-bikes local mobility project, and also to install new renewable energy generation for the borough. So again, a really good example in terms of that sort of plural ownership of the economy pillar, and a really good way of involving the community in that decision-making process when it comes to climate change and also to community wealth building as well. And then I think this is my final kind of national case study before we move on to some more information on what's happening locally in the West Midlands. But this is around procurement. So one way of trying to support local businesses that's been happening again in different parts of the country is bringing procurement as a function into the economic development teams of local councils. So this idea of sort of looking for opportunities to support and influence local SMEs is really emerging as a key local economic development tactic to promote a more inclusive local economy. So as a result, recently of the pandemic and the need to administer business support grants, many councils now have much stronger intelligence about the nature of their local business base and local SMEs. So in councils such as Fife in Scotland, Carmarthenshire in Wales, and Luton as well, they're using this intelligence to target their own procurement expenditure towards growing and diversifying their local SME base. So essentially, economic development officers are engaging with local SMEs to make them aware of their goods and services pipeline, with a view to more of their supply chains being delivered by local businesses. So it's really about fostering a much stronger relationship between procurement teams and economic development teams in local councils, and really sharing that intelligence so that when procurement go out with a tender, they're not just sort of blindly putting it out there and waiting to see what happens, actually working with that intelligence that they have on the local business base to make them aware of opportunities. And through this engagement, these local authorities are also using this as an opportunity to address the environmental crisis. So, for example, supporting local SMEs with retrofit and access to environmental grants. And there's a range of other things as well. So in terms of supporting local businesses with the adoption of the living wage, as well as initiating discussions around succession planning to potentially transition to being a worker ownership. And this really enables these local businesses to grow and develop with greater social and environmental purpose. So hopefully those case studies bring to life a little bit more what community wealth building is. We've sort of given you a little bit the theory, but I think it's always much easier to kind of understand and get the sense of what it's like when it's actually highlighted in practice and how it's worked. So just to kind of finish us off, really want to bring us back into the West Midlands in terms of what's happening locally. So again, there'll be a few case studies which hopefully just bring the model of community wealth building to light, but just also highlights really how this model can be applied to all different sorts of areas, because even within the West Midlands itself, you have all different types of contexts, different types of geographies, and all these different types of areas that have been pursuing community wealth building. So just as a brief little history in terms of particularly the work that we've been involved in, the kind of community wealth building work in the West Midlands really started about 5 years ago in Birmingham. So started off with the Birmingham Anchor Network, which is a partnership primarily of large public sector organisations in Birmingham, so the City Council, NHS Trust, a couple of the universities and a couple of housing associations as well. And then through the work in Birmingham, the Black Country started to explore it. So I was quite heavily involved with the Sandwell Anchor Network, which I referred to earlier. Much smaller place, so not as many of those kind of large public sector organisations. So we had much more involvement from the voluntary sector and the private sector as well. Wolverhampton, a couple of years ago, set up an anchor network which has quite a strong focus on procurement and the Wolverhampton Pound. Most recently, I've been working on a Black Country anchor network, which is cross-authority. So kind of highlights, obviously, we've got city-level anchor networks, we've got borough-level anchor networks, and then we have large cross-authority anchor networks as well. So in the Black Country, working with the 4 areas of Sandwell, Dudley, Wolverhampton and Walsall, each of those areas has either an anchor network or some kind of similar anchor institution type partnership. So the Black Country Anchor Network isn't necessarily there to do all the work for them, but it helps connect those local networks, helps them share good practice and ideas. And there are also some projects that work better at a regional level than at a local level. So in Walsall, they have a partnership called Walsall Together, which has existed for quite a few years, and they've decided to use that as their anchor network. In Dudley, they're currently in the process of setting their anchor network up, starting off in a sort of reverse way. So often the anchor networks will set the network up and then work on the projects. In Dudley, they're actually working on projects first and kind of using that to spur the interest in an anchor network. We have a larger thing going on at Clare's, which started a few months ago at a combined authority level. So we've just started a project with the West Midlands Combined Authority called the Inclusive Economies Partnership, which is a 5-year project funded by the National Lottery. And the aim is to really build on all the great work that's been happening in the West Midlands over the past 5 years and try and get a more joined up regional approach. And just recently we've started doing a bit of work in Warwickshire as well. So we're currently in the process of creating a community wealth building action plan for Nuneaton and Bedworth Council. And we've been having lots of conversations with Nuneaton anchors, but also anchors across Warwickshire as well. And through that, this one's in italics, but we've discovered that there is a Coventry and Warwickshire Anchor Alliance, which has happened without any involvement from us, which really shows how much the anchor network message has taken off over the past few years. It's kind of outgrown us in a way. But yeah, it sounds like they've got some stuff going on as well, which just in the process of trying to have some conversations with them and find out what they've been progressing on. But as you can kind of see here, there's so much going on in the West Midlands now, with pretty much every part of the West Midlands involved in some kind of community wealth building type project, particularly in the combined authority area. I just want to highlight some of the different projects that those areas have worked on. So starting off with a kind of employment theme, one of the most impressive projects that's happened through community wealth building is something that's happening in Birmingham and Walsall, but also now across the Black Country. So in Birmingham, it's a project called I Can. It started off during the pandemic with the Birmingham Anchor Network, where the coordinator of the Birmingham Anchor Network said to the anchors, what is a problem that this network can help you solve right now? And during the pandemic, the issue the NHS were really struggling with is that they were finding it hard to recruit staff, but particularly staff to entry-level roles. So things like, admin jobs, facilities jobs, and so on. But what the housing associations were really struggling with is that a lot of their tenants were being made either redundant or they were on furlough from jobs in the hospitality sector. And obviously this had an impact on the housing association in the sense that it meant the residents were perhaps unable to pay their rent. But obviously the housing association had a kind of pastoral concern for the residents as well. So they created a program called Hospitality to Health, and initially they supported around 20 to 30 housing association residents into careers in the NHS sector. So it was about taking individuals that had been working in hospitality but had transferable skills and values that they could take into careers in the NHS. And like I say, although they only supported around 20 to 30 people, it's still a kind of great initiative. But what it did, and what often this tends to happen with the kind of anchor network community wealth building projects, they start off small, but what they do is uncover much bigger issues, which leads to a much larger project. So with Hospitality to Health, what they realised is that there were real issues with the way the NHS did recruitment, particularly in Birmingham, but I think this might well be the case nationally as well. So when it came to entry-level roles, so kind of band 2, band 3 positions, they were asking for way more than really should have been expected for the types of positions. So, kind of in-depth previous experience, NHS experience, long list of qualifications, when really, for example, if it's an admin role or if it's a kind of facilities role, perhaps as a porter or working in the kitchen and things like that, often those are things that you can be trained in, and as long as you have the right values, you could be a good fit for the NHS. And actually, they were ignoring plenty of people that could have been a good fit due to the way that they did recruitment. The application forms were very lengthy as well. It was quite difficult to fill them in, and all sorts of issues. So they expanded it into a program called I Can, which is now all 5 NHS trusts across Birmingham and Solihull. It's led by the ICS, and essentially it is now all entry-level jobs across those 5 NHS trusts targeted at any resident in Birmingham and Solihull, but particularly those who are unemployed, also who might be disadvantaged, might be a young person or something like that. And they work together with other anchor institutions such as housing associations, the voluntary sector, and local authorities to really get into the most deprived parts of Birmingham and Solihull, particularly those that are least represented in the Birmingham Solihull NHS workforce, to try ultimately and make themselves more representative of the people they serve, but really to provide job opportunities for those who are furthest from the labour market. So they have different types of entry-level roles, so clinical, admin, and facilities. They've separated them down. Each of those roles has a simple person specification. And as I said, it's all values based. So rather than focusing on experience and qualifications, it revolves around whether you have the right values to work for the NHS. And then the individuals get pre-employment training to get them job ready. So if it is, for example, an admin position and they don't have previous experience in admin, then they get 2 to 3 weeks of pre-employment training to ensure they're job ready. And once they're in the position itself, they have pastoral support. And so far, the program's been running for about 1.5 years, and they've supported over 300 residents into employment. And they have another over 200 people who are waiting to go onto the program. So it's been a huge success. It's something that's happening in Walsall as well under the name Work for Health. Their model is slightly different, ultimately works the same. It's a little bit smaller. Theirs focuses on the moment just at support service assistants and clinical support workers, but they have had over 100 residents supported into employment, and the pre-employment training is delivered by the local college as well. In terms of the kind of impact that it's had, so looking at I Can in Birmingham, it's, as I said, it's made them much more representative of the people that they serve. So 69.4% of the individuals who have gone on to I Can are from BAME communities, which is much higher than the percentage of BAME employees currently working in the NHS in Birmingham and Solihull. A high percentage of younger people, of older people as well, 37% with a self-reported disability, and 23.3% increase engagement from wards with the highest levels of disadvantage. And then in terms of the impact it has on the local economy as well, using some kind of Public Health England statistics, for every unemployed person that is brought back into work, it adds around £21,000 to the local economy. So I'm not great with quick maths, but in terms of over 300 people, that's a lot of money back into the Birmingham economy. They've had a 95% retention rate, and they've also saved money as well. It's made it a much more streamlined, simplified process for the NHS to do recruitment, which previously they were struggling to recruit to those roles. So not only does this programme have a huge impact on the individuals in terms of alleviating them from poverty, in terms of reducing health inequalities, which obviously has a huge impact on the NHS, but it also makes it much easier for the NHS to recruit, which was the initial problem they were looking to solve. And we're currently in the process of expanding this out into the Black Country. So you can see here just a bit of a diagram which shows you ultimately how the model can work. So if you start off with the employer, so in this case, using the NHS as the employer, then you have outreach organisations like housing associations, the voluntary sector, local authorities and DWP, who can really go out into the community to identify individuals who might be interested. And then you have local colleges as the kind of training providers. And actually in Dudley, they're in the process of starting their own version of I Can. They've decided to focus on local authority jobs as well as NHS jobs. So it's very much a programme that can fit any sector. And the ultimate aim in Dudley and the Black Country is try and get this out into all different kinds of sectors, whether it's public sector or private sector. But the general aim is sort of values-based entry-level employment, making it much easier for local residents, particularly those who might be long-term unemployed, to get into entry-level roles in the public sector or the private sector in their local area, and really give them a kind of strong, rewarding career. The next case study is around procurement. So I mentioned earlier, this one sort of breaks down a little bit how an anchor institution can really start to focus their procurement on supporting local businesses. So in Sandwell, with the Sandwell Anchor Network, what we did first, and what most areas will generally do first, is sort of baseline what the levels of local spend are. So really work out how much each anchor institution is spending in the local economy. So for example, Claire's, we have a spend analysis tool. It's just a sort of simple Excel spreadsheet, but organizations can input their top 300 suppliers, and as long as they've included the postcode and the value of the contract that year and things like that, you can work out how much they are spending in the local economy. So if we take, for example, a couple of the anchor organizations in Sandwell, the NHS was spending only 3% in the local area, so really low numbers. If you look at the wider sort of Black Country Birmingham geography, it was a bit more, but still not a huge amount, so 18.2%. So actually much smaller than even the Preston figures that I showed you earlier. Excuse me. So really low numbers for the NHS, but then there were different organisations in Sandwell. So for example, one of the housing associations, in terms of the overall Black Country and Birmingham geography, they were spending over 96%. So some of this can be explained by the fact that the NHS do procure a lot of niche products, so medical products that can't be made anywhere else. They just have one supplier who kind of delivers that product. They're also often quite restricted by central frameworks and so on. So we weren't necessarily looking to try and convert 97% of that leakage from Sandwell into Sandwell businesses. But what we did was have a look at where we could influence. And what was also apparent is, although the housing association, the sort of stuff they were buying, you could more easily buy from a local supplier, which in some ways explains why their local spend was so much higher. They did have quite an intentional strategy to spend local. So that was something that the NHS didn't have, and they were sort of keen to address that. But we decided to break their spend down into what could be influenced and what couldn't. So of that 97%, looking at, well, what's already in the kind of West Midlands geography, what is a medical product that at present cannot be bought anywhere else, and things like that. And I think we were left maybe with 20 to 30% that could be influenced. But if you turn that into pounds, in terms of millions of pounds, it's still quite a substantial amount of money. And we looked in particular at sectors where each anchor was spending money. So things like food, office furniture, stationery, workwear, and so on, and really had a look at where that money was being spent. And we decided initially to focus on food as a bit of a pilot. And what we found is that all of the anchors were buying food, pretty much all of them actually were getting it from the West Midlands, except for the NHS, who were spending over £1 million on food, and none of it was in the West Midlands. And really what was quite bad about this is that a lot of the things they were buying, the other anchor organisations were buying the exact same things, but from West Midlands based suppliers. So there was not necessarily any real reason why some of this money was going out of the local economy. So as one example of something that we did, we sort of looked at the anchors that were purchasing their food locally, and we just got them to share details of those local businesses with the NHS. So a really kind of simple activity when you break it down like that, in terms of just finding out what you're spending locally, what you can influence, and then working together as anchor institutions to just share some of that good practice and some of that knowledge on the local business base. So eventually what happened is the NHS, for example, moved a dairy contract over, and this is £135,000 contract. So compared to this, the prize potentially that was on offer of £1 million, it might not seem like a huge amount. But with an anchor network, we generally encourage starting off small. So in Birmingham, when they've been doing procurement activity, they've been looking at small contracts, so anything from £5,000 to £25,000, and actually just trying to create a process that even makes those contracts easier to win for local businesses. So getting a contract that's over £100,000 can have a real impact on a local business, and it can create local employment opportunities as well. So what you see is a bit of a multiplier effect. So when you keep that money locally, that local business are then perhaps more likely to spend it with the local business to create employment opportunities, to employ local people, and then it becomes a bit of a kind of circular effect. So In Sandwell, we had that focus on encouraging anchors to spend local, but we also had another focus of working with local businesses to ensure that they had a relationship with the anchor institutions and ensure that the anchors knew that they existed and what they did. So we did a range of different things like meet the buyer events, publicity and engagement and so on. Then a final couple of case studies in the West Midlands. These ones are a bit more, have a bit of a sort of climate change angle to them. So in Wolverhampton, they did a piece of work which sort of centres around the land and assets pillar. So the starting point for them is, like most of the areas, they have a net zero target, particularly a sort of West Midlands Combined Authority target to work towards by 2041, and they need to reduce their carbon by 69% by 2027. So when they were thinking of innovative ways to do that through an anchor network, they set up a partnership between the council and the NHS in Wolverhampton, and they realised that the council had some publicly owned brownfield land which had been essentially derelict for many years and wasn't being used. And they decided to turn that land into a solar farm, but the solar farm specifically was going to power a hospital that the NHS Trust were building in Wolverhampton. So what you get there is that it's reducing the reliance on fossil fuels, it's making sure that land is used more productively, but it's also having a benefit on the local population of Wolverhampton for many years to come, in the sense that it's powering a new hospital. And then there's the stuff that I mentioned earlier around retrofit as well. So trying to create a retrofit supply chain to ensure that more of those opportunities go to local businesses. So in the Black Country, there's around £90 million of retrofit works that are happening. There are very little businesses in the Black Country that can do retrofit. There's around 10, which for a population of, over 1 million, I think nearly 1.5 million people is quite a small amount. So really it's about trying to ensure that more local businesses can access retrofit accreditations if they want to move into that space, working with local colleges so that they can run more training courses for individuals who might be interested in becoming a retrofit installer, and so on. So really it's about trying to kind of connect those opportunities and keep that money local. So hopefully that's brought community wealth building to life a little bit. And just to finish off, to bring us back to where we are in terms of Stratford and Warwickshire, obviously, as I mentioned earlier, we are doing some work in Nuneaton at the moment, and just really thinking about how this type of work could be applied locally. This is a graphic that my colleague designed for Nuneaton, which sort of shows how over the past 15 years, in terms of poverty and deprivation, really nothing has changed. So these red bits on the graphic in Nuneaton are the most deprived parts of Nuneaton as per the index of multiple deprivation. And if you were to play a game of Spot the Difference, you'd probably struggle. Nothing really has changed over 15 years, and that is despite obviously the best efforts of the council, of the national government, the other anchor institutions, and so on. So it's clear that a lot of economic strategies really are not working. Obviously, Nuneaton is the most deprived part of Warwickshire, but that's not to say that places like Stratford don't experience issues as well, that there isn't a place for community wealth building in Stratford or the wider Warwickshire. These are just some graphics that I took from a report that the County Council did a few years ago, which highlight the different issues that are faced here in terms of fuel poverty, in terms of food bank use, low income families, and so on. So I think it's just really to highlight that community wealth building can be applied everywhere, and really it's a flexible model. So particularly in terms of the anchor networks, we have anchor networks in all different kinds of places. They have different politics, they have different geographies, they have different anchor institutions, they have different populations. We've spoke to all kinds of different places across the UK, so places as rural as the Highlands in Scotland down to the Isle of Wight, big cities such as London, Birmingham, Manchester, boroughs, Sandwell, Dudley, coastal towns. We've done lots of work in Wales and Ireland as well. So it's very much a flexible model that can fit local need, local opportunity, and local challenge. But really, it's ultimately about having that intent to do things differently, to realise that the model that we have at the moment for trying to fix the economy often is one that hasn't been working. So those benefits that growth is supposed to create really have not been benefiting local people, and that wealth hasn't been retained. So it's all about trying to ensure that we spread that wealth more equally, more fairly across people, and ensure that every person in a local area kind of benefits from it and gets that opportunity, whether it's through their business being supported or through a local employment project that might be created. So yeah, hopefully that's just gave you a bit of a sense of what community wealth building is, the reasons why we're doing it, and some inspiration in terms of how it could be applied to Stratford, or perhaps elsewhere in Warwickshire, or wherever you might live, but that it's, yeah, ultimately a model that can work anywhere. So I think that's me for the presentation. So thank you all for listening. I hope you found that insightful and enjoyable. And as I say, I'm sure there'll be lots of extra information we can circulate. We have a website as well. If you want to have a look, we have loads of different publications on community wealth building, on net zero, retrofit, all different kinds of things. And of course, you're welcome to send me an email if you want to ask me more questions, although of course I know we have some time for questions now, so it'd be great to hear people's thoughts, and happy to answer anything that might have sprung to mind throughout the presentation. But yeah, thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you very much, Lauren. That was really, really good and really exciting to hear that there's so many interesting and profitable projects that can be brought about through the community wealth building approach. I was just wondering, it might help to kind of break it down for some people who might have struggled with all the details. Just if you were to go into an area which has no background in community wealth building, wasn't doing it at all yet, what would be the first steps that the CLES would take? What would be the kind of the ground zero of community wealth building, so to speak?
Thank you. Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, generally what we do is try and establish what is already happening locally, because one thing you don't want to do is sort of duplicate. And although an area might not have an intentional community wealth building strategy, they might well be doing community wealth building without actually realizing it. That's something that we find quite often. The same with the anchor network as well. They might not have an intentional anchor network, but they might have some kind of partnership of anchors. So generally what we do is establish what's already happening locally and make sure that you sort of build off good success. So that would be a good starting point. And then if there were things missing, so for example, if you did feel that there wasn't a partnership of anchor institutions, I mean, again, that's something you find in some areas, that the anchor organizations don't really have a relationship, perhaps do not speak to each other that often. It's about trying to bring them together, trying to get them to understand why it's a worthwhile model. So sometimes they ask, what's in it for me? I mean, if you're an organization like a local authority, an NHS trust, a housing association, or whatever, obviously they have a social responsibility to care about the people that they serve, but there are often some quite direct benefits that they can experience as well, like with the ICANN model in Birmingham. Obviously it helped the NHS recruit people, which it was struggling to do. So it's about trying to find a way in that kind of sounds, that kind of wins them over a little bit as to why they should get involved, and also about finding where the energy is as well, and where the interest. Some areas might have more of a stronger interest in procurement or employment or land and assets or net zero, or wherever it might be. So when I started the work in Sandwell, they'd been talking about procurement and local business for years, but they'd never done anything about it because they didn't really know where to start. So I think the anchor network gave them a little bit of an outlet, and we sort of said to them, well, we've got this tool, you can do a bit of a spend analysis. They didn't even know how much they were spending locally. So it's just about trying to get them to a starting point where they know, where they're already at, and give them a sense of where they can get to, obviously by sort of explaining other case studies. Obviously we kind of worked them through that process of looking at where they were spending. But yeah, I'd say, in terms of a starting point, just look at what you already have, and there might well be things that could well be expanded, or it might be the case that there are things missing which can easily be addressed just by setting up an anchor network and focusing on some of those key areas of procurement and employment tend to be the easier places to start, I would say.
Thank you. I see the hands are starting to go up. But just before we move on to the audience, would it be an accurate summary then of the kind of core strategy to say, you get the anchor network together, you analyze their spend, you make as much of that spend available to local businesses and the local economy as possible, so you're creating a demand in the local economy, and at the same time you're using your skills programs and your funding and so on to try and to kind of seed and set up the local companies that will meet that demand. So you're kind of building supply and demand at the same time, and building the local economy, the whole local economy through the activities of these anchor institutions.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the anchor network is always a good place to start, because then it ensures that an organization isn't doing things in isolation, and that they can, share opportunities and challenges and really achieve that kind of economies of scale. But as I say, a lot of areas might already have a pre-existing partnership that they can kind of utilize. But yeah, a good starting point is always just to know where you're at. So what you're already doing, what you aren't doing, how much you're spending locally. You can look at employment as well. So I know we did quite in-depth research in Wolverhampton, where each of the anchors were able to provide details of all the kind of employment figures, so the different parts of the city where most of their employees came from. And if you break that down into pay scale, what you find is that obviously more of the kind of senior Wolverhampton employees were not based in the local area at all, and things like that. So you can really identify perhaps where they have the least representative kind of geography in their workforce, and target employment programs at that local area, and things like that. But yeah, I think a bit of analysis and baselining always goes a long way, just to know where to get started. But as I say, my top tip would always just be to follow the energy. So where the energy is in your area, what the interest is, and where you feel you can get the most momentum, because sometimes you run the risk of starting these things off and then they kind of don't go anywhere, because you're talking about things that people aren't that sort of interested in, or maybe they do it already. So it's about trying to find where the added value is, where's the kind of niche that an anchor network can really help with.
Thank you. And I've been told there's some echo on my voice, so maybe I'll pass on to Janet to share the Q&A, if that's okay. But I think David had his hand up first with a question. David Mond.
Okay, thanks very much. I mean, I find the whole thing really thrilling. It seems so clear that routing investment into local companies should benefit the local community. But I can imagine that councils have to make spending decisions and are often constrained to adopt what looks like the cheapest bid. And very often big corporations can undercut local organizations. So how do you persuade councils to do this? And I mean, I should add to that question: have you persuaded any council, any Conservative council, to do so?
Thank you. In terms of the first point, yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is the caveat to a lot of this work. I won't lie and say that it's really easy, because certainly it does take a long time and there's a lot of convincing that you have to do. And yeah, there's certainly an element to not just local authorities, but other, especially, public sector anchor institutions who do have those factors around cost that they have to consider. They also often have staffing issues. So I know particularly one thing we've heard from procurement teams and local authorities, that's a sort of an area that they really struggle to recruit to. There aren't that many procurement professionals, and obviously the private sector tends to pay better. So you do get a lot of procurement professionals moving over. So there were times when I worked at Sandwell Council where actually I didn't have anyone to speak to, because they didn't have a kind of procurement, they didn't have many people in the team. So they therefore didn't really have anyone who could engage. So you do sometimes struggle with that. I think there's a few different ways of kind of persuading them. I mean, one thing is that ultimately what you're selling to them is this will improve the local economy. So I think the case study I had earlier about trying to connect the procurement and the economic development teams, at the moment, local authorities do things in silos, they do things in isolation, and it's about saying, well, they should have more of a connection, so that when procurement go out with a contract, they work with the business growth team, the economic development team, who know what the local business base is, who can support those local people, and ultimately then they're sort of working together. And rather than procurement just having that focus on I need to get the cheapest contract, it's well, actually we're trying to support local business. Sometimes what they find is that when they support the local business, it's cheaper. So when I put that example up of the dairy contract in Sandwell, the 135k dairy contract, the NHS actually saved about £3,000 doing that. Not a huge amount, but it just kind of showcases that there was no real reason why they were getting that dairy from elsewhere when other local anchors were getting it locally and were sort of getting it cheaper. So sometimes it's just a case of that the way they do procurement, they have a kind of fixed way of doing it. And again, they don't quite know who the local business base is. So actually, if they build those connections, they'll find that they can kind of get better deals. There's obviously the kind of climate change benefit to procuring locally, because you're reducing the time it takes for things to get there. You are reducing, the carbon impact. So again, most local authorities will have some kind of net zero strategy. The same applies to NHS trusts, universities, and so on as well. So you can also use that as a bit of an incentive to encourage them. So yeah, I think there's a range of different things. As I kind of said earlier, like, you want to encourage them to think about their local people and their local economy, because ultimately that's what they're there for. But sometimes you do have to give them a selfish, what's in it for me reason. So if you're a kind of stressed out procurement officer in a council and you've got a really stretched team because half your team have left, ultimately you are trying to make their job a bit easier for them, because if they have that connection to the local business base and the business growth team do it for them, if they go out and say, look, there's a dairy contract coming up, do you want to bid for it? And that business then bids for it, then it makes it a much kind of quicker, easier process for the procurement team. And in terms of working with any Conservative councils, yeah, we've worked with all different types of councils across the country, from all kind of political persuasions. Off the top of my head, I did a lot of work in Harlow, which is a Conservative-run council. Their focus specifically was on procurement. So the whole project was about procurement and getting them to spend more money locally. We've got the project in Nuneaton as well, which is Conservative ran. And again, they're really interested in trying to support local business. So we're just actually in the process of engaging with their local business base through the Coventry Warwickshire Chamber of Commerce to get a sense from local businesses as to how they feel about how easy it is to access public procurement opportunities. And yeah, a range of other different types of councils as well. The work we did in Sandwell, the director of procurement there is the director of procurement for Dudley NHS as well, which again is another Conservative-run council area, and they really want to try and do replicate the food procurement work in Sandwell in Dudley as well. So yeah, ultimately, and I think, when I first met Stephen, it was a sort of question that he asked. I think that's the other good thing about community wealth building. I feel quite strongly that it's not politically aligned, because ultimately it's a principle that any kind of political party can get behind. Ultimately, it's about supporting local business. It's about supporting local people, providing employment opportunities for local people, but particularly for those most in need. It's about trying to, get to net zero, utilize our land and assets in a better way. So yeah, I think no matter the political persuasion, it can be applied. And yeah, as I say, we've worked with all kinds of areas across the country. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. We've got 3 people waiting to ask questions. There's Ali, and then Dave, and then Jane. So Ali first.
Right. Thanks very much. My video is really flaky, so it'll probably start flashing at any minute. So I'll switch it off if it does. Brilliant presentation, Lauren. Thank you so much. I'm policy officer for Warwick and Leamington Labour Party. I'm also part of the Warwickshire Climate Alliance. And there's a little group of community wealth building enthusiasts who've been trying to get Matt Brown to come down and talk to us since 2019, and we never managed it. And I don't know if Dave Sternberg's been talking to you recently, but we've actually got an opportunity now to maybe get something motoring here, because we've got a new Warwick District Council administration. We've got a Green Labour coalition. I think the deputy leader, Chris King's actually on a community wealth building group. And we were talking about getting someone to come down and actually address the council and talk about community wealth building and explain the benefits. You'd be able to do it so much better than any of us could, I'm sure. So I think, bearing in mind that we have got financial issues locally, certainly the council is supposed to be skint, it's a golden opportunity to refresh and really look at how money is being spent and what it is being spent on. And there's all sorts of issues. We've got so much house building going on around here. It's absolutely pitiful, the number of houses that are being built, mostly developer houses, that don't have solar panels. I mean, it's just criminal, really. And so the whole issue is about retrofitting, and maybe local people could be trained to do the retrofitting. It's just waiting there, really, to be discussed and for people to see the benefits of. So that's the first thing. The other thing is, you mentioned the Coventry and Warwickshire Alliance. I'd be interested to know because it's the first I've heard of it, so I'd be interested to know what's actually going on with that.
Great, thank you. Yeah, Dave Sternberg has been in touch with me about potentially coming over to Leamington Warwick to speak, so it's on my to-do list to give him a call. For some reason my emails to him keep bouncing back, so I managed to track him down on LinkedIn and get a phone number. So yeah, I would absolutely love to come over and speak to yourselves, and would be great to try and progress community wealth building. I'm really passionate about just trying to get it out into Warwickshire, which is my patch of the West Midlands. I tend to do a lot of work in the Black Country, but I've never actually lived there, always been in Warwickshire, so would love to do this kind of work over here. And oh, sorry, what was your second point? I can't remember.
You mentioned the Coventry and Warwickshire Alliance, and I just wondered what that, I know it was in italics, so like I gathered it was kind of not really actually properly happening, but it's something that was on the back burner, so be interested to see what that's about.
Yeah, we've sort of heard about it in different capacities over a sort of year or so period. I was working quite closely with someone from the Black Country LEP, and he had kind of heard about it through the Coventry Warwickshire LEP. But then, as with most LEPs, they sort of folded earlier this year. So I managed to get in touch with someone from the Coventry Warwickshire LEP who said, yeah, I used to run it, we're not involved anymore. Maybe speak to Coventry Council, tried to get in touch with them, didn't really get much traction. So different people seem to have heard of it and different people seem to not have. And then through doing the project in Nuneaton, we did a procurement workshop, and some of the procurement officers in Nuneaton Council said, yeah, we go to a Coventry Warwickshire Pound group. But the impression they got is the group was set up, but they'd kind of stalled with momentum. I don't think they necessarily knew where to take the group. So yeah, we're just in the process of trying to find a contact and get in touch with them to work out what they're up to and see if we can sort of support them in any way. We've got this big combined authority project happening that I mentioned earlier, and we have at the moment really strong connections in Birmingham and the Black Country, but not as many in obviously Coventry as part of the combined authority, but Warwickshire as well. So we really want to try and bring it all together, perhaps get those anchor networks to meet, and so they can kind of all share what they're working on. So yeah, hopefully as I kind of continue conversation with yourself and Dave, I can let you know when we sort of hear more about it, and yeah, see what they're up to. It's a bit of a strange one. It's really good that they've started working on it. You know, just they've obviously Googled it and found out about anchor networks and set one up, which is something that we're starting to find across the country now, which is quite nice. But I think the slight problem with that is that then they perhaps don't know where to start sometimes. So it'd be good just to kind of chat to them and sort of work out if they want any guidance really on where they can take it next.
That's great, thanks Lauren. What I'm going to do is put my email address in the chat, so that I've just WhatsApped Dave to tell him that you've had some issues. So I'll put my email in the chat, and then you can always copy me in as well. But great. Yeah, please do come and speak. I'll talk to Chris King, the deputy leader, and we'll see what we can sort out between us.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Thank you so much.
No worries.
Dave, I think it's you now.
Right. Hello, Lauren. An adjoining district council, Cotswold District Council, adjoining to Stratford, issued a municipal bond and I think they raised about £1 million to install EV chargers across Cotswold District. And I know a lot of other authorities up around the country have issued municipal bonds, and I wondered if they fitted into your wealth building sort of perspective.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's certainly an option. Particularly, would maybe look at it in the perspective of the kind of finance pillar of community wealth building. I think I had up earlier the Oldham Energy Futures project, which we have a whole kind of toolkit / publication on the website. And I think initially they looked into releasing kind of community shares for people to purchase to run a sort of local energy company. I think they didn't quite get enough interest in the beginning to proceed with it, but it was certainly on the agenda. But I know I've heard other colleagues mention these types of things before in terms of community shares, municipal bonds, for people who are kind of interested in funding particularly things around community energy. So yeah, absolutely, it's definitely an aspect of community wealth building. It's perhaps slightly more ambitious, challenging one. So generally when we start with an area, we do tend to look at procurement and employment, because they're a little bit more simpler in the sense that often areas are kind of doing those sorts of things already. So it's just about getting them to kind of shift the thinking. But I think the land pillar, the finance pillar, that's sometimes the kind of bigger projects, particularly when it comes to addressing climate change. But absolutely, it's the really blue sky stuff that we'd love to achieve. So that sounds like a really interesting project in the Cotswolds.
So is there problems in funding the sort of projects you're talking about?
Yeah, I think that's definitely part of it, particularly when it comes to, the sort of community renewables, community energy. That is sometimes where they meet the kind of stumbling blocks. Sometimes it's just the intent. So we mentioned earlier the things around the pensions. I mean, trying to get pensions reinvested into the local area is probably one of the biggest prizes. It's much higher amounts of money than the kind of local procurement stuff, where sometimes we're talking about really small contracts. But it obviously involves much more political and sort of leadership intent to get those things off the ground. And I think generally with community wealth building, what we have found works best is starting off small, following where the energy is. So if there was someone who approached us who said, "Oh, I'd really like to reinvest our pension into the local community," obviously we'd love to do that. But often you find people are interested in community wealth building, but councils, other public sector obviously are quite strapped for time, strapped for money, have often competing priorities, have difficulties with staffing, as I mentioned earlier. So it's sometimes a bit more of a harder task to kind of get to those levels. So what you really want to do is start off small so that you can demonstrate why it works, and then ultimately they start to work on the bigger stuff, which is what happened in Preston. They did the procurement stuff and then they started to do the pension stuff. So sometimes it's looking at the kind of longer term approach, I guess. But really it's just about finding out what that area is interested in, and if they have the intent and the willing to do something bigger, then absolutely that would be ideal.
Well, I was going to say, this is similar to investing pensions locally, isn't it? Because it's investing savings locally rather than people investing them in some big savings, company, which they don't know what's happening to, what that is being used on. At least people would know where it's being used locally then, wouldn't they?
Yeah, exactly.
About right. Thanks.
Thank you.
So Jane.
Thank you. I think you've kind of answered some of my question, and so I've got a bit of comments and a bit of questions, and I've got lots of things I'd like to ask, really. But I guess when you began, I was starting to think, is this like this localism sort of thinking, can that be unhelpful? Because if you imagine if London and the southeast just thought locally and their money never kind of got out of that area, is that counterproductive? But then what I liked is, as you went on, it seemed like it's a much more less ideological and more pragmatic, your approach. And then I think, as you were just saying just now, that starting with something where there's some energy and interest and a need in the local area, where people say, well, we could really do with some help with this, sounds like the best place to start. And things like, I thought the 0-hour contract example, which is something slightly different. And so it sounded like there are some things that are about empowering people whose situation is just, it's in a way, it's a bit of a no-brainer that that's not a good way to go about things. But then you empower local people to address it differently. I mean, one of the things I've been thinking just locally, I've been looking at solar panels and a heat pump thing to replace my boiler and thinking, couldn't we get people locally together as a cooperative to bulk buy something like that? So that's a much more kind of bottom up. And then there's another level at which it's get into the big institutions where there's just stupid ways that people do things because they're part of a big institution and that's just how we've always done it. I mean, I think the example about the NHS, anyone who runs a small business who couldn't recruit good quality staff to low grade jobs would have made that change years ago. It seems it's just because you're public. So that, am I right that there's kind of, you come in lots of different ways, empowering from bottom up, getting into a big institution, try and disrupt the way people are thinking. Am I getting the drift?
Yeah, definitely. No, you've summarized it really, really well. I think, probably how it started initially was more of the top down focus, particularly in the UK with Preston. It was that, they were relying on this investment to come in to kind of change change the city, to kind of reshape the economy. The investment didn't happen. They didn't really know what to do. So it was sort of about, well, let's look at what you already have. And actually what you have is being used quite wastefully, in terms of your land, your money, and obviously in terms of the employment powers that they had as well. So it's just really about, my colleague explained it really well to me the other day. He had a bit of a light bulb moment, but I think with the public sector, they see themselves as having social responsibility, but not necessarily an economic role. The private sector is sort of the reverse. They see the economic role, but not always the social responsibility. And perhaps certainly that is where the private sector can come into the kind of anchor institution conversation. But from the public sector, that kind of top-down approach, it is, like you say, it's about getting them to think differently, do things differently. And that is where it does sometimes get difficult, because they're very used to working in that particular way. And a lot of the time, it just seems obvious. We've had so many people who have said that around, the employment program in Birmingham, like, that just seems obvious. Why weren't they doing that already?
Yeah.
But, for whatever reason, they just weren't. They just hadn't thought of it, and they had
kind of institutionalized, aren't you?
Yeah, exactly. And we can't fix everything, and CLES has always worked at a local level, and obviously there are other organizations that do things nationally. You obviously need a national focus to change things. We don't have influence over everything, but it is about looking at where we can have influence and where we can start off small, follow that energy, and ultimately try and use that, ultimately trying to get systems change, institutional change, but with the caveat that we know that's going to take a long time. But in the meantime, just try and get some of the momentum building, and improve the impacts of individuals and local businesses.
Start where you can. I know there was a link put in with some tools or something, I think Stephen put in earlier, because one of the things that I think can be difficult when you're just an ordinary member of the public is trying to put the economic case together. And so I don't know if any of your tools help to do that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that the toolkit Stephen put in is specifically the one we produced around the Oldham energy futures. So that's looking particularly at climate, and I think it has different case studies for anchor institutions and individuals. I think the kind of question of how the community is involved with community wealth building is a strong one, and certainly, as well as trying to encourage those big organizations to do things differently. You gave a really good example about the co-op thing as well. And it's looking at how individuals can do things differently, and ultimately trying to bridge the gap between the kind of larger anchor institutions and what we would call community anchors. So again, the employment project in Birmingham is quite a good example, because they utilise the voluntary sector to reach out into communities in Birmingham, where previously the NHS, didn't have any reach out, or really had struggled to engage with those individuals. So that's another area where the community can become really key. But every area is different. So any area we could work in might do something completely different, and not necessarily follow any of those kind of case studies. And that's certainly what we found. Most of those areas, what they did, they were the kind of first area to try to intentionally trial something specifically like that. So it is just really about finding out what the energy is, and also what the unique challenges and opportunities might be. Ultimately following those pillars, but really focusing it so that it builds on what the local need is.
Yeah. Thank you.
No worries. Thank you.
Janice invited me to try talking again. Am I still echoing? I am.
I can hear an echo. Yes, sorry.
It's okay though.
It's okay. Okay, well, does anyone else have any questions? Any additional questions? I'm not seeing anything. Just see if I've got any questions here. So, one question I have, I think Claudine has a question, I'll just ask mine first. One question I have is around, you said earlier that you favoured working with public institutions. Some of the big institutions locally would be, for instance, Jaguar Land Rover or NFU Mutual and so on. And I guess they are probably, as you would say, extractive. They're taking money out of the area, but they also have local supply chains which could be directed inwards. So, what do you? What is that a paradoxical situation? Would working with them improve the project, or would it kind of undermine it in some way? What do you feel about that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's one we're still grappling with a little bit at Claire's. I think when they started the work in Preston 10 years ago and they kind of came up with the definition of anchor, they chose the term anchor because it refers to organisations who are very literally anchored to that place. So if you're, Stratford on Avon District Council, you can't one day just say, I actually kind of fancy being Coventry Council today. You can't move your business. And obviously in the private sector, that's slightly different. So Jaguar Land Rover, if they really wanted to, obviously they could move, their production to somewhere else, whether it's elsewhere in the UK or internationally, as we have seen some businesses do. So I think that was the initial rationale. It was looking at those organisations that were anchored to that place, who by being public sector hadn't ever really seen themselves as having that economic role. Over the years, obviously, we've started to get these questions and raise those kind of issues as to what the role of the private sector is. And I think, it might be different in every area. And something that kind of complicates the matter is each area will have a lot of private sector organisations. So if you're including them all, it would probably be way too much for kind of productive conversation as an anchor network. But what I did in Sandwell is, in Birmingham, when they set up their anchor network, they had a very strict definition of an anchor institution. So it had to be public sector, had to spend £6 million per year, had to employ 250 people, and had to have some form of land or asset in the city. When I came to do the anchor network in Sandwell, there were 3 organisations that fit that category. So the council, the college and the NHS. And 3 is kind of a bit too small for an anchor network because the organisations, don't always necessarily have time to show up to the meeting. So we just never would have got anywhere. So one thing I did was include some organisations that were on a more regional level. So the ICS, the Chamber of Commerce, there was a few housing associations that worked on a Black Country level. But in Sandwell, they had a really strong interest in procurement and they had a really good relationship with their private sector businesses. They had a group of individuals called the Sandwell Business Ambassadors who represented the business community in Sandwell and who had been working quite closely with the council to try and get some momentum to address the procurement issue, but it had never really gone anywhere. So it felt it would be remiss to not include them in some way. So what worked quite nicely is because they represented the business community in the private sector, rather than trying to invite every single private sector business in Sandwell or even the large ones, we had a group of people and the Chamber of Commerce as well who could kind of represent that sector. So we had some of the business ambassadors did the spend analysis for us, and then also we kind of just used them as a voice for the business sector. So that was really key. And we did the same with the voluntary sector as well. So we couldn't include every voluntary sector organisation, but there is the Sandwell Council of Voluntary Organisations, SCVO. So again, they kind of represent the voluntary sector community in Sandwell. So they're sort of able to provide that connection and that voice. So that's initially what we looked at in the first year or so. And then eventually we started to have the conversation about, okay, should we invite some of the bigger ones? So DPD, the delivery company, have a really huge presence in Sandwell. And there's a couple of others as well. So obviously the ones you mentioned in Stratford. So I think really it's up to an individual area to think about what is the best approach for them. And there's different ways of going about it. Sometimes you can get different types of organisations involved on a project basis. They might not be a formal member of your anchor network, but they might be relevant for a particular project that you're doing. So certainly in Birmingham with the ICANN model, the voluntary sector aren't a formal member of the anchor network, but they work on the ICANN project. And I know in Sandwell, DPD had a really good employment project around offering work experience to local sort of teenage age school children in the area with learning disabilities. So that was a sort of partnership between the DPD and some of the anchor institutions in the form of some of the local schools, and neither of them were kind of formal member of the anchor network, but they were coming along to the meetings to kind of tell us about the project. So yeah, it's a bit of a roundabout answer in the sense that I think we organisations still haven't answered it ourselves. We're kind of in the process of reevaluating our definition of anchor institutions, and actually myself and my colleague who's based in Birmingham are in the process of writing a bit of a publication that reflects on anchor institutions but actually uses the West Midlands as a case study to kind of show the different types of anchor networks that have been set up in the West Midlands, and hopefully starts to, if not answer, then at least start to ask some of those questions about private sector involvement, which might lead us to do a further more in-depth piece kind of looking at that. So I'll keep you updated and sort of pointing to when we kind of publicise those publications. But yeah, I think ultimately it's just up to an area. If Stratford wanted to set up an anchor network and include, you know, Jaguar Land Rover, then we wouldn't say, no, you can't do that. That's against the rules. You know, it's really just up to an area and who they feel they want to get involved. And yeah, it's really about following the energy and following the most passionate people. Not every area will have the same organizations that are really interested in this. So you might have some public sector people who are really interested in it, some private sector people who are really interested in it. I just go for, you know, whoever is the most interested. Then you have the most chance of getting something done and actually being able to prove that the model works.
Thank you. Okay, Claudine, you want to ask a question?
I was trying to work out whether it was actually a question. I'm afraid it is just ever so slightly a comment coming from the local council world, parish and town councils. I did actually look up procurement policy, and generally speaking, small parish and town councils, collectively, there's quite a lot in Stratford district, over 100. I'd be interested to actually look at the budget and income and how they spend their precept. But I looked at it and just went, oh yes, local contractors preferred. The council recognises the benefits to the economy of using local businesses and will seek out local contractors and suppliers wherever possible. So I guess I'd be looking to the district council to be saying, and what is your policy on that one? Because you've got possibly the biggest spend on grass cutting, on waste contractors, for example. So if town and parish councils are doing their best, and let's hope they are, to choose local, we'd be looking at our district council to also join in that example and find partners to do the same. So yeah, I was trying to work out a question other than to say there are 10,000 town and parish councils up and down the country. So collectively, that's quite a lot of spend. And if they're encouraged, reminded again, actually, it's reminding them that that is where they've come from, is that procurement policy. But quite often they're so frightened of spending public money, they tend to choose cheapest and not necessarily best for their local area. So it might be worth reminding them of that.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I think, as far as I'm aware, we've never done a huge amount of work with the kind of parish town councils. I remember we did a project in the Isle of Wight last year, and we did a couple of anchor network workshops, and we invited the parish town councils. I don't think they were able to make it, but it'd be really interesting actually to compare the local spends, as you say, of the parish town councils, the district council, the county council, you know, looking at the different tiers and seeing if there is any kind of difference. It might be that, yeah, perhaps because maybe the parish town councils feel more locally rooted, and maybe that's why they're more inclined. But it'd be really great to do a sort of spend analysis on an area like Stratford that has those three different tiers to see if there's any difference.
They do actually have, I'm just thinking about the Shared Prosperity Fund and the fact that Stratford District Council will be allocating a significant amount of money in the way of projects, and whether even part of that could be reminding those project people. And I'm sure they are, given that climate is closely linked in job skills. But it would be reminding the applicants that they should be thinking local. It's just, sometimes it's just a case of reminding people of the benefits. It can be hard to remember when you're thinking, I must find cheapest.
Yeah, definitely. And sometimes it's about having more of a intentional strategy as well. I think most organizations definitely understand why it's better to procure locally, and you know, some of this is not necessarily new stuff that we'll ever have heard before, but they do have those constraints, as you say, trying to find the cheapest contract, or they're time pressed because they don't have a full team of procurement officers or whatever it might be. But sometimes the message needs to be a bit more structured and a bit more formal to them, for them to feel actually it's part of my job description to try and procure locally, to try and have an impact on the local economy. I think that's where they don't often quite see it that way. You know, that procurement team will be very siloed from that economic development team, and they don't see that they have a mutually beneficial relationship with each other. And that's where you're trying to bring them, actually, if you work together, you'll make life easier for each other, and ultimately you'll impact the local economy, which is working for a local council. That should be the main priority that you want to achieve.
Okay, Ali's got her hand up again, but before we move on, Janet has put a link to a form in the chat to evaluate Great Big Green Week events. So if you have attended Great Big Green Week events, and you have, if you attended this one, then it would be great if you could click that form and maybe after the event, just take a couple of minutes to fill that in. Thank you. But Ali, do you want to go ahead with your question?
Yeah, just thinking there's quite a bit of overlap between Stratford councils and Warwick and Leamington that would really make it worthwhile for local companies contracts. So I mean, I've been talking to Stephen a bit about this, but I think that's something that as we move forward we could bear in mind.
Yeah, no, that sounds really good. I mean, when we've been speaking to Nuneaton at the moment, you know, me and my colleague have very much said, in terms of the procurement, a lot of the anchors in Nuneaton work at a more Warwickshire level. So getting them to, you try to say to them, you need to spend all your money with Nuneaton businesses, they might think, why? So actually it's trying to look at it from a more Warwickshire perspective might sometimes work easier. So yeah, perhaps if we could, you know, if the different district councils did decide to start looking into community wealth building, obviously we know Nuneaton officially are looking at it now. It would be good perhaps to get them together and to kind of to sort of speak about it and to sort of share perhaps what they could work on together. And that's sort of what we're doing in the Black Country as well, although the areas there are slightly bigger. Obviously you've got cities like Wolverhampton. Some things do tend to work better at a more regional level because they share a lot of infrastructure. They share, you know, there are organisations who operate at that kind of larger geography who, if you try and tell them to spend at a very specific local level, you know, they might not be interested in that. But if they're a Black Country based organisation or Warwickshire based organisation or whatever, they might be more interested. You know, that to them is their local. So it works a little bit better in terms of the procurement question.
Okay, does anyone have any other questions? I have one, but if anyone else wants to go first? No. Okay, well, my question is, are there any national policies that you would be looking to kind of benefit the community wealth building strategy? What should we be looking to a national government to do to support this kind of work?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think, as I say, you know, we've often worked at a local level, just, you know, in the sense of there's a lot of organisations doing things nationally, and we've always felt that we've had more impact. But ultimately, if you could get national governments to implement some kind of community wealth building strategy, it would really help on a local level, because then it gives people more of an incentive. So actually, we've done a lot of work in Scotland, and the Scottish government have taken community wealth building on quite strongly. So they actually became the first country to have a minister for community wealth building. I think he has a couple of other responsibilities. I think he's the Minister for Community Wealth Building, Regeneration and something else. But that's quite a kind of progressive thing that they did. And I remember a couple of months ago we spoke, I think it was Dundee Council, and they said, well, a few years ago we did community wealth building and we tried to get an anchor network together and we found it kind of difficult. And then all of a sudden the Scottish government got the Minister for Community Wealth Building, and I mean, just recently this year they've published a community wealth building strategy, the Scottish government. And Dundee Council were like, and now all of a sudden all the anchor institutions in Dundee are coming to us to say, can we do community wealth building? So sometimes having the national government interested in community wealth building helps in terms of, you know, really feeding that message downwards and giving people, I guess, a sense of accountability, you know, that there is a wider structure that they are part of. You know, obviously there's, you know, elements of community wealth building that the national government can take on themselves. They'll obviously be an employer, a procurer, and all that sort of thing. But I think the real role they have is, you know, as a convener. You know, community wealth building ultimately does work better at that kind of local level or perhaps at a regional level. But where the national government can add value is by encouraging those areas to take it on as a model. And I think as well, the kind of other thing that they can do, I mean, in terms of the role that devolution plays as well, it gives areas a sort of more longer term focus. So a few months ago, I mean, part of the reason we had the conversation with Dundee is we're doing a project called the Future of Local Economic Development. So we were speaking to different economic development teams across the country, and sort of seeing if over the past few years, especially with COVID and obviously with the advance of models like community wealth building, whether they started to do things a bit differently. You know, if they're no longer focusing on GDP as the model, perhaps they have a stronger focus on well-being and climate, and obviously you know, keeping things local. And quite a few of the areas sort of addressed to us that one thing they face real difficulty with. I mean, a few of you have mentioned the Shared Prosperity Fund, for example. I mean, those kind of grant funding pots that the government give out obviously can be quite beneficial to an area, but what the problem is you're kind of encouraging local areas to compete with each other, and obviously not every area benefits. But the real issue that local authorities were telling us about is that often they're quite short term, so they get maybe 2 to 3 years to spend it. And community wealth building, when done right, is a much longer term approach. So it's not really giving them the time or the capacity to do what they want to be able to do. So if national government, or even you know, even if it's a kind of devolved government level, so with a combined authority, if they have an intentional community wealth building strategy, or it might be, you know, sometimes it's referred to as inclusive economy, inclusive growth. If they have that kind of strategy, they can sort of use any funding they have to encourage local areas to do it on a more sort of longer term. So, for example, with the sort of Birmingham and the Black Country ICANN employment stuff I was mentioning earlier, in the Black Country, the local colleges do the pre-employment training, and they actually do that because they're utilising combined authority adult education funding. So kind of utilising devolved sort of, you know, regional support to get local projects up off the ground. So yeah, I think that's really where the value can be added. It's about trying to have a more intentional, cohesive approach, rather than just every few years giving people different amounts of money and trying to get them to spend it over a couple of years. It's trying to have more of a long-term thinking, and that's what we're starting to see in Scotland now. You're getting all these different local authorities working on community wealth building in a cohesive way, and they're working quite closely with the government on it, and that is where it can be most successful, and where we're finding that they are tending to do some of the more progressive stuff now in Scotland, because they feel they have the freedom and the support to do it. They don't have to worry as much about, you know, some of the questions that have been raised here around trying to get the cheaper contract. They know they're being supported to pursue community wealth building. So that's really where it you know, it can be most useful, I think.
Thank you. Any last questions? I'm not seeing anything. So there will be a video recording of this made available via email. If you're not on one of the mail, if you're Stratford based, you know, please send us an email at info@stratfordclimate.org, or if you're